Every once in a while, you run across a watch that just defies tradition, one that doesn't really fit into any specific category. For example, this one right here aesthetically seems to be a mixture of a sports watch and a field, yet it also has 200 meters of water resistance, an extra scratch-resistant coating, and a mono-bloc case, which means it's also just as capable and tough as most divers out there, as well as kind of being an oddball in the world of horology. So if you ran across a watch like this, what would you call it? Well, if you're Citizen, you just call it what it is. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're talking about the Citizen Promaster Tough, one of the most suggested and requested reviews I've had. So a few months ago, when I just happened to run across one on sale, I jumped on it. Now, these days, Citizen seems to be ignored by a lot of watch collectors out there, primarily because they're interested in automatics, and Citizen seems to be focused on making solar-powered quartz. So I don't think Citizen gets quite the amount of respect it should, and this watch is proof of that. It's thin, lightweight, comfortable, and tough as nails. Pretty much everything you could want in a tool watch. So in terms of specs, you're looking at a 42mm wide case, 46 with the crown, and a lug-to-lug of 51. Which all sounds fairly standard, yet it is a little bit more complicated thanks to that mono-bloc case, as there are some pros and cons that go with it. One of the benefits is that it keeps the case fairly thin at 10.5mm, which is pretty amazing when you consider the 200 meters of water resistance, as this is a watch you can dive with, yet shouldn't get in the way of anything you're wearing. As well as it gives the watch a fairly low center of gravity, so even though it's a bit heavy at 180 grams with its bracelet, it never really feels top heavy and is well balanced on the wrist. However, there is a downside. Now, since there is no real case back, you feel all 42mm of that watch spread across the back of your wrist. So even though the Promaster Tough visually stays true to that 42mm, I think it is larger on the wrist, and perhaps feels closer to a 43. Yet there is one more advantage here, as the back of the case is one nice continuous smooth surface. So even though the Promaster Tough feels a little larger, I found it to be extremely comfortable as it sits flush against my wrist. Now, with my 7-inch wrist, I typically don't like a lug-to-lug this long, but here it wasn't really a problem. There still is a bit of an overhang, but the back of the case starts to curve as it goes out to the end of those lugs, which just helped it conform to the natural curvature of my wrist. The Promaster Tough is a pure tool watch, and I think that's very evident when you look at its stainless steel case, as practically every nook and cranny here has a brush surface, with a vertical brushing on the top and bottom and a horizontal brushing on the side, as well as a circular brushing on the very top of the bezel. Although interestingly, the side of the bezel almost looks like it has a bead blasted finish, which I think helps to further highlight and just focus your eyes on the top of the bezel and the dial. However, despite the very industrial look here, the case itself is very smooth to the touch, which may be in part to the extra scratch-resistant coating that Citizen added, and they refer to that as a super titanium coating, which I think is sometimes also referred to as Duratec. Looking at the overall case design, I think it's rather simple and straightforward. The Promaster Tough is a tool watch and it knows it, so there's no polished chamfered edges or too many other frills here, with the exception of this angled edge at the end of each lug, as well as these smaller angular crown guards that protrude just slightly out the side. And those crown guards mostly act as just a nestling spot for the slightly smaller signed crown. The crown is a little small, so it can be harder to unscrew and use, but since this is a solar-powered quartz, you're not going to be doing that too often. And sitting right above the dial, you have a nice flat sapphire crystal, which, if you've been collecting watches for any length of time, really shouldn't be a big deal. In fact, it's usually a bigger deal when it doesn't have sapphire. Yet, this is the first time I've seen sapphire on a Citizen, let alone a relatively affordable one. So I do want to point this out, and I hope it's something I see more often. Now, there are a few other colorways of the Promaster Tough, as well as a completely different watch that's known as the Promaster Tough Ray Mears. That one has some similarities, but it is different. I think it's a little smaller, made of titanium, and I believe it's only really available in the UK. Now, this Promaster Tough has a flat black multi-tiered dial with silver and white highlights. Starting at the edge and working our way in, you have a raised angular chapter ring, which has minute indicators painted on in white, which sits right at the edge of the middle layer, and that middle layer is just wide enough to contain the hour indices. The indicators here are all bars, with the exception of the 12, which is an upside down triangle. which kind of gives you a beacon to help orientate the positioning of the watch, but that's about it. As the rest of the indicators are all bars, there's no real crosshair effect going on. Each indicator has a thin metallic frame, and then that is then filled with white luminous paint. The indicators aren't very tall, but that thin metallic frame combined with the white paint gives it a really nice sharp outline. It helps it stand boldly out against the black backdrop. And lastly, we drop down just slightly to the center section of the dial, which is here mostly to contain the text, as well as the ill-conceived date window at the right. Generally, I prefer a date on an everyday watch, but this date window here is so small and so recessed that it's really hard to read, kind of to the point that it's practically useless. The good news, however, is that it's so small that it doesn't disrupt the design too much. Most of the time when I took a quick glance at the watch, I forgot it was even there, as the white date wheel just tends to blend into the index at the 3. So I don't think it's a deal killer in any way, but I do want to know who thought this was a good idea. Now, sitting on top of everything, we have the hands, and there's a few interesting things here. They're kind of like an industrial version of a Delphine handset, where they're a little wider and a little more geometric at the end. Yet they still have that raised ridge down the middle, and then it slopes down as it goes to the side. The benefit of that is that they aren't flat, and they do have some height to them. Now, the hour hand is also confined and exists in the same plane as its sunken middle section, whereas the minute hand then stretches out over all of that to just glide over the indices. Although I would like that minute hand if it was just a tad bit longer, coming much closer to the chapter ring. And the same could be said about the red arrow second hand, of which I absolutely love the touch of color here. It just gives it some needed flair without doing anything overly complicated. And for those pausing and checking at home, no, the second hand isn't lined up. It's not horrible, but it is pretty obvious. Honestly, at this point I've given up obsessing over lined up second hands. I've seen misaligned second hands pretty much everywhere I've looked. Now, that doesn't mean it's always going to be off, but for those that are more sensitive to it, just realize that it's going to be a possibility. Another thing I want to point out is that in these macro shots, the edge of the hands look a little rough. But it's not something you see in person with the naked eye. This is a watch that knows it's supposed to be a purpose-built tool watch, and I think the design reflects that. It's not an overly clean design in any way, but it's rather straightforward with some visually interesting elements, as well as a nice sense of symmetry, and perhaps an even better one if they got rid of the date. One thing I like is how every section of the dial seems to have its own purpose. It just separates out the various elements from each other. And once you realize that, it's rather intuitive to use. As well as that multi-tiered dial leads to a nice sense of depth, which is pretty impressive for a watch this thin. When it comes to Citizen Promasters, I'm usually pretty impressed by the Lume, and especially with their divers. Yet the Promaster Tough is just okay. Initially it's nice and bright, and where typically with Citizen you would see mostly blue Lume, it's green here, with the exception of the minute hand, which winds up giving it this two-tone effect. So for this comparison test, I was really focused on how does it compare to Seiko Turtle, as well as Citizen's new Nighthawks. Now, out of the three, the Promaster Tough fades out first, which may be due to whatever green Lume that Citizen is using, as it doesn't last as long as the blue. Now, since the other two don't last a lot longer, I'd say for what it is, the Promaster Tough is still good for Lume. It's just not Seiko Diver good. Which leads us to the movement, and there's not a whole lot to talk about here. It uses a Citizen caliber E168, which is one of Citizen's standard solar-powered quartz movements. Which means that as long as it's getting the occasional amount of sunlight, it should give you a good decade, or maybe even 3 of good service. Now, as far as the bracelet, I'd say it's pretty good for a Citizen. It's an H-Link style bracelet with the same great solid feel and scratch-resistant treatment as the watch. The bracelet has solid end links, solid links, and surprisingly a mostly milled push-button clasp. It starts out at 22, then tapers down to 20 before the clasp, which I think makes it just a little bit more comfortable. Although personally I think they should have gone even further and tapered it down to 18, as the clasp does feel a little large and beefy against the back of your wrist. My only real complaint here would be that the fit between the links could be better, as there is some wiggle room here between each section, and that can lead to a little bit of a rattle. But overall I think it's pretty good for the price, and very comfortable. The fully articulating links, as well as the female end links, easily let this wrap and conform to your wrist. Prices always fluctuate, but these days I've been seeing the Promaster Tough from $270 all the way up to $370, and I think there's a lot of value here. I can't think of another watch quite like it to compare it to. But if you think about it, most people love microbrands in this price range as they offer features that Seiko and Citizen usually don't, such as sapphire, solid bracelet with a milled clasp, and scratch-resistant coatings. Yet this is a Citizen that has those features. So in maybe some ways this is more the exception than the rule. But regardless of that, you're still getting a lot for your money here. It's a watch that's thin and comfortable, yet tough as nails, so you never have to worry about it. I think every good collection needs some sort of grab-and-go quartz watch, and this would be a great choice. The solar movement should keep it running for decades, while the sapphire and the scratch-resistant coating should keep it looking good as well. Anyway, that's my take on the Citizen Promaster Tough. Let me know yours down below. Or if you can think of another Citizen that I should take a look at, let me know that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.